The wind moved first. Hard, dry, white with blowing snow. It crossed the empty stretch of Crow Ash Draw and scraped against a leaning line shack at the base of a frozen hillside. By November, the cabin already looked half defeated. The boards had gone gray from weather. The chimney leaned slightly north. Frost gathered beneath the floor before sunrise, and every night, long after the settlement lamps went dark, strange sounds came from inside. Wood creaking, nails pulling, floorboards lifting one at a time. Then the light disappeared beneath the cabin. Bram Calder, a wagon bed repairman, forced out of town with 2 children after his wife died, spent his nights digging below the floor instead of feeding the fire above it. During the day, he carried small sacks of dirt to the frozen creek and scattered them thin across the snow so nobody would notice. People thought desperation had finally reached him. They were wrong. He was fighting for survival more fiercely than any of them. He was digging because he believed the coming Wyoming winter would kill the children sleeping over his head. This is not the story of a man who lost his mind. This is the story of a man who remembered a kind of wisdom the world had forgotten. And if you believe that the oldest survival secrets are sometimes buried right beneath our feet, then, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and listen to how one desperate father defeated the winter by disappearing into the earth itself. By the end of the summer of 1889, Bram Calder had already lost more than most men could carry quietly. His wife, Eleanor, had died slowly through 6 weeks of fever, while the Wyoming heat still sat over the valley. After that, the debts came due faster than the morning did. The small house near the timber road had never belonged fully to Bram. The paper sat in the hands of Tom Vardell, Eleanor's older brother, a cattle supplier who measured life the same way he measured feed barrels and fencing wire. By October, he wanted the property cleared before winter. There was no shouting, no threats. Just a wagon, 2 children, a few rope-tied tool crates, a stove with one cracked leg, and a man standing silently beside everything he still owned. Martha Calder, only 9 years old, tried to help tie the load down like she understood what was happening. Silas Calder, his 6-year-old son, asked twice when they were coming home. Bram never answered directly. The line shack outside Crow Ash Draw had once belonged to a range rider. Low roof, crooked walls, one window patched with old flour sackcloth. The floor leaned slightly east, and the gap beneath the boards was wide enough for a man to push his wrist through. People watched the wagon leave town without saying much, but they watched long enough. In places like Crow Ash Draw, silence often carried the worst predictions. That first night, after the children finally slept, Bram knelt beside the cabin floor and pressed his palm against the boards. Cold moved through the wood like running water. The shack measured barely 12 feet wide and 20 feet long. It sat low on uneven stone piers driven into hard ground years earlier by some forgotten range hand, who likely never planned to winter there himself. The walls were rough cottonwood planks, thin, warped. But Bram noticed quickly that the walls were not the real problem. The cold came from underneath. Western wind crossed the draw without slowing down. It slipped beneath the shack through the open crawlspace and struck the floorboards from below like river water under ice. Every night, the boards lost heat faster than the stove could replace it. By dawn, frost formed in pale lines along the cracks in the floor. The water bucket carried a skin of ice before sunrise. Damp air gathered beneath the bed frame. Martha slept in wool socks that never fully dried. Silas carried split wood from the pile, with purple fingernails and trembling hands. Bram tried the usual fixes first. He packed dry grass beneath the floor, hung old canvas feed cloth around the base of the shack, burned more wood than he could afford to lose before December. Nothing changed. The stove stayed hot. The room stayed cold. That was the part Bram kept thinking about. Heat was rising, but warmth was disappearing. One night, long after midnight, Silas woke coughing so hard he gagged beside the stove while flames still burned orange inside it. Bram wrapped another blanket around the boy and stared down at the floorboards again. The cabin was not losing the fight at the walls. It was bleeding heat through the empty space below their feet. Years earlier, before marriage and debt and Wyoming winters closed around him, Bram Calder had spent seasons repairing flumes and wagon platforms for small mining camps west of Casper Ridge. The work took him underground, more than most men liked. He remembered storage tunnels cut into shale hillsides, root chambers beneath bunkhouses, half-buried tool sheds where iron stayed dry, and water barrels never fully froze, even in January. The deeper spaces always felt the same. Still air, quiet earth, no wind. Not warm in the way a stove was warm, but steady, stable. The kind of cold that did not keep stealing from a man every second he sat inside it. Bram did not know scientific terms. No one around Crow Ash Draw did. What he understood came through skin and breath, and years of touching wood, stone, mud, and frozen iron with bare hands. One night, while the wind hammered beneath the shack hard enough to rattle the bed frame, Bram lay awake listening to it move under the floorboards. Then the thought finally settled into place. The cabin did not need to stand higher against winter. It needed to sink lower beneath it. Near midnight, Bram pulled back one loose board beside the stove and reached his hand into the darkness below. The earth underneath felt calmer than the room above it. Before dawn the next morning, Bram Calder removed 3 floorboards beneath the children's bed and stacked them quietly beside the stove. Cold air drifted up from the darkness below, but the earth underneath looked different than the frozen world outside. Hard near the surface, softer farther down. He started digging before the first light touched Crow Ash Draw. The tools were simple. A short-handled spade, an old bucket with a bent rim, a mining shovel worn thin along one edge from years of rock work. Bram worked slowly to keep the shack from shaking. One scrape at a time, one bucket at a time. He only dug while the children slept or before they woke. During the day, he carried small amounts of dirt away beneath burlap feed cloth and scattered it near the frozen creek bank where wind-blown snow hid the color difference. No pile ever stayed long enough to draw attention. A few inches down, the soil changed. The ground lost its sharp, frozen bite. Damp earth replaced brittle frost. The deeper Bram reached, the quieter the cold felt. Silas slept directly above the growing hole each night, unaware that his father was carving space beneath him inside the earth itself. Martha noticed first. One evening she woke and found the oil lamp glowing through the open floorboards while Bram disappeared below the room. She stared at the hole for a long moment before asking softly, "Are we hiding?" Bram climbed halfway back up the ladder frame he had started building and shook his head once. "No," he said. "We're getting below the cold." After that, Martha stopped asking questions. The next night, she held the lamp steady while her father kept digging. By the second week of digging, people in Crow Ash Draw began noticing things that did not quite fit together. Fresh dirt appeared along the frozen creek bank after every windstorm. Bram Calder bought scraps of old canvas from the trading post, along with 2 rusted stovepipe sections nobody else wanted. And more than once, riders passing the shack after dark saw lamplight glowing beneath the floorboards instead of through the window. Small towns watched quietly before they spoke openly. Elias Rusk, the settlement's oldest carpenter, finally rode out to the shack one gray afternoon while Bram was cutting willow branches near the hillside. Rusk had built barns, bunkhouses, and bridge decks across 3 territories. He understood timber better than most men understood weather. He circled the shack once before crouching near the loosened floorboards. "Men build upward against winter," he said, "not downward into wet ground." Bram kept cutting branches. Rusk continued anyway. He warned that damp earth would rot the shack from underneath. That trapped moisture would poison the children's lungs before spring. That the floor would eventually sag inward under its own weight. At the general store, Nolan Price laughed quietly while weighing lamp oil and called Bram a man digging himself into the ground. Nobody in Crow Ash Draw truly hated him. That was the harder part. They pitied him. From their porches and wagon benches, people watched the silent father carrying dirt in old buckets and assumed they were seeing desperation take shape. A few days later, Elias looked down through the open floor and spoke more softly than before. "You bury children under a cabin," he said. "You bury them twice." By early December, the space beneath the shack had begun to resemble something more than a hole in the ground. Bram Calder shaped it into a narrow sleeping pocket just wide enough for 3 bedrolls laid shoulder to shoulder. Flat shale stone lined the lower walls. Bent willow ribs supported the ceiling where the dirt looked weakest. Dry grass and scraps of canvas were packed into gaps to slow the cold moving through the soil. For 2 nights, Bram believed he had solved the problem. Then the shelter pushed back. Moisture gathered first. Thin beads of water formed along the ceiling and dripped steadily onto the bedding platform. The air turned heavy after the trapdoor stayed closed too long. On the 3rd night, a section of loose dirt near the eastern wall suddenly broke free and slid into the corner, beside where Silas had been sleeping only minutes earlier. The sound froze Bram harder than the winter wind ever had. For the first time since he started digging, he wondered if Elias Rusk had been right. Martha held the lamp while her father tore down part of the wall and rebuilt it deeper into solid shale. He changed the angle of the intake pipe so cold air entered lower and moved upward instead of settling around the bedding. A second, narrower exhaust pipe rose behind the chimney stones where wind could pull stale air out naturally. Dry stove ash was spread beneath the platform to absorb dampness. The sleeping boards were raised higher off the dirt floor. The work took 3 more nights. Nothing about it looked clever. Nothing looked clean. But slowly, the shelter changed. The air stopped feeling trapped. The ceiling dried. The earth settled into place instead of shifting against it. Bram finally understood something the cabin builders above ground never had. The earth could protect a man, but only if the earth itself was allowed to breathe. The first hard freeze came during the 2nd week of December. Ice locked the creek solid before sundown. Fence posts cracked in the cold after dark. Even inside the shack, frost crept pale and thin across the corners of the window cloth. That night, Bram Calder carried 3 things below the floorboards: an old mining thermometer, a candle stub, and 1 wool blanket. He stayed underground alone for nearly an hour. The difference was immediate. The candle flame barely moved. No draft touched his face. The air felt cool, but not sharp, not hungry. Above him, wind still hammered against the shack hard enough to rattle loose boards. Down below, the earth swallowed the sound until only a dull murmur remained. The thermometer settled near 50 degrees. Upstairs, the water bucket had already started freezing again. Bram rested one hand against the packed soil wall beside him. The dirt felt warmer than the cabin floor overhead, but he still did not trust it completely. Cold weather proved very little in Wyoming. The real judgment always arrived with the blizzards. 2 nights later, Bram moved the bedding below the shack for the first time. The shelter looked rough even by frontier standards. Low ceiling, dirt walls, shale stone, darkened by lamplight. But the air inside stayed calm while the wind outside kept growing louder. Silas climbed down first, carrying his carved wooden horse under one arm. "The floor doesn't bite," he said quietly after kneeling beside the bedding platform. Martha came slower. She kept glancing upward at the heavy beams and packed earth over her head, as if expecting the whole hillside to collapse during the night. Bram said nothing to push her faster. He simply hung the oil lamp near the vent pipe and spread their mother's old quilt across the blankets. That seemed to help. Above them, the shack creaked and shifted under the western wind. Loose boards snapped softly against old nails. Snow hissed across the roof. Below ground, the shelter stayed still. For the first time in weeks, Silas slept through the entire night without coughing once. Martha eventually drifted asleep beside him with both hands tucked beneath the quilt. Bram remained awake longer than either child, not because of fear, because for the first time since arriving in Crow Ash Draw, he was no longer waiting for the fire to die. By the final week of December, Crow Ash Draw began changing in small ways that experienced men noticed immediately. Snow started falling sideways before the wind fully arrived. Horses stood with their backs turned west for hours at a time, refusing feed even while the temperature remained manageable. The air grew so dry that old cabin boards cracked sharply after dark, like distant rifle shots. The older trappers called it white pressure weather. That phrase traveled quietly through the settlement, faster than any official warning could have. People stacked extra cordwood beside their doors. Chimneys were cleaned twice instead of once. Families patched wall gaps with cloth and mud. Elias Rusk spent 3 straight days helping neighbors extend chimney height, convinced stronger draft and hotter fires were the only things that kept a Wyoming winter from taking lives. Bram Calder moved in the opposite direction. While other men prepared to fight the cold above ground, Bram widened the shelter another 8 inches downward and reinforced the lower walls with flatter shalestone carried from the hillside. He sealed weak seams with packed ash and clay. He shortened one support beam to make the ceiling lower and tighter, so less heat could drift upward. One man prepared for winter with bigger fires. The other prepared by disappearing beneath it. Late one evening, Bram stepped outside while snow drifted white across Crow Ash Draw and listened to the wind moving through the darkness. Most men looked toward the sky when bad weather approached. Bram looked down at the frozen ground beneath his boots instead. On January 7th, 1890, the storm finally arrived. It came not with thunder or warning bells, but as a white movement across the open land. Snow blew sideways through Crow Ash Draw before sunrise. By noon, the hills had vanished behind a wall of drifting white. The temperature dropped so fast that wet boot tracks froze solid within minutes. The old trappers had named it correctly. The Three Forks whiteout had come down from the north. Across the settlement, people answered the storm the only way they knew how. More wood, bigger fires, hotter stoves. Smoke thickened over Crow Ash Draw as every family tried to build a wall of heat against the cold pressing inward. But Bram Calder approached the storm differently. He knelt, pressing his palm against the shack floor. The cold underneath now felt stronger, faster, like water moving under river ice before a break. Without hesitation, he began moving their supplies. Food crates went below first, followed by water buckets and blankets. He did not wait for the shack to fail before leaving it. Bram understood that winter often killed through delay. That night, with the temperature having fallen to 31 below zero, he lowered both children into the shelter. Martha carried the oil lamp carefully down the ladder, Silas following with the wooden horse held tight against his chest. Above them, the shack groaned under the wind's pressure. Below, the shelter remained still. After the children were safe, Bram did something no one else in Crow Ash Draw would have understood. He climbed back upstairs, stood beside the stove for a long moment, and smothered the fire down to embers while the blizzard was only just beginning. Finally, he followed them down and pulled the heavy trapdoor shut. The moment the hatch closed overhead, the wind nearly vanished. The screaming pressure outside became a distant, muffled sound somewhere beyond the packed soil walls. Inside the shelter, the air stayed dry and strangely calm, tight, dark, and low enough that Bram could not fully stand upright. Yet the thermometer beside the shale wall still held near 51 degrees. Martha sat silently beneath the hanging lamp for several seconds before finally pulling off her gloves. Then she looked at her hands. For the first time in weeks, her fingers were no longer aching from cold. And in that moment, she finally understood what her father had truly been building beneath the shack. Not a hiding place. A place where winter could no longer reach them. The Calder family remained beneath the shack for 4 straight days while the whiteout buried Crow Ash Draw above them. Time changed underground. Morning and night no longer arrived through windows or sunlight. They arrived through routine. Bram Calder climbed up twice each day for only a few minutes at a time to keep the chimney from freezing shut completely and to check whether drifting snow had blocked the intake vent outside. Every time he opened the trap door, the storm attacked immediately. Wind roared down the ladder shaft like an animal forcing its way underground. Loose snow scattered into the shelter and melted across the top steps before Bram slammed the hatch closed again. The sound above carried enormous pressure with it, endless movement, endless cold, but the shelter below remained unchanged. The candle flame burned straight and steady. Breath no longer cut at the lungs with every inhale. The shale walls held a slow, stubborn warmth gathered from the earth itself. Martha spent hours reading quietly from an old Bible wrapped in cloth to keep the pages dry. Silas slept deeper than he had since leaving town. His coughing disappeared almost completely. Even bowls of cooling soup stayed unfrozen beside the bedding platform. The deeper truth revealed itself slowly. The shelter was not simply warmer than the shack above. It existed outside the storm's control entirely. That realization unsettled Bram almost as much as it relieved him. On the third day, he climbed back down after clearing snow away from the chimney pipe and could barely close the hatch because his hands had gone stiff with cold. His beard carried frozen white along the edges. Snow clung to his coat sleeves in hard-crusted patches. Martha watched silently while he sat against the shale wall shaking. It took nearly a full minute before the trembling finally stopped. Above them, the whiteout continued tearing across Crow Ash Draw without mercy. Below ground, the earth barely seemed to notice it existed at all. By the 8th day of the Three Forks whiteout, Crow Ash Draw had stopped fighting winter with confidence and started fighting it with fear. One chimney fire lit the north edge of the settlement before dawn, after a family overloaded their stove until the flue glowed red. Men hacked the burning pipe loose with axes, while snow blew sideways around them. 2 cabins farther down the draw, an entire family slept crowded shoulder to shoulder around a stove so hot the iron legs sank into the floorboards. Furniture began disappearing. Kitchen chairs, broken shelves, bed slats, anything dry enough to burn. Wood piles vanished beneath ice, and drifting snow faster than men could uncover them. Children suffered first. One boy lost feeling in 3 toes before his mother noticed the skin had turned gray. Another family wrapped frozen feet in heated flour sacks while smoke rolled thick through the cabin because opening the chimney draft meant losing heat too quickly. Elias Rusk still fed his fire harder every night, still trusted flame over everything else. But the old carpenter finally saw the truth spreading across his own cabin floor, one bitter morning, when frost began growing inward from the corners beneath the walls. Thin white lines at first, then solid patches of ice creeping slowly across the boards themselves. The cold was no longer outside. It had entered the structure completely. Abigail Cross, a widowed neighbor living alone near the south edge of Crow Ash Draw, rationed her last armload of firewood down to individual pieces and stopped boiling water except at night. Across Crow Ash Draw, desperation settled over the settlement heavier than the snow itself. And beneath the line shack at the edge of the draw, Bram Calder's shelter remained steady. The lamp still burned clean, the walls stayed dry, and the earth beneath the storm kept holding its temperature, while the world above it slowly failed. When the storm finally broke, Crow Ash Draw emerged slowly from beneath the snow like a town digging itself out of a grave. Men shoveled paths between cabins shoulder deep in places. Frozen doors had to be chopped open with axe heads. Chimneys stood buried halfway to their tops. Smoke rose thin and weak across the valley after days of near silence. Abigail Cross waited until midday before walking out to Bram Calder's shack, carrying a tin jar of broth and 2 hard biscuits wrapped in cloth. She expected sickness, expected coughing, weak voices, children wrapped beside a dying stove. Instead, Bram opened the cabin door calmly, his beard trimmed white with frost, but his eyes steady. Then he lifted the trapdoor beneath the bed. Warm air drifted upward immediately. Not hot, not heavy, just alive. Abigail climbed down carefully into the shelter below, while Bram held the lamp above the ladder opening. Martha sat against the shale wall, reading quietly beside the light. Silas slept curled beneath the old quilt with both cheeks still carrying color. No coughing, no shaking, no smell of smoke trapped inside desperate air. Abigail removed her gloves slowly after reaching the bottom. She pressed one hand against the shale wall beside the bedding platform and stayed there without speaking for several seconds. The shelter was dry, still, almost unnaturally calm after the violence above ground. Finally, she looked around the underground room once more and spoke so softly it barely sounded like a sentence at all. "It's warm down here." Bram gave only a small nod. Nothing more needed explaining. Outside the shack, children across Crow Ash Draw were still wrapped in bandages for frostbitten fingers and feet. Below the floorboards, Silas Calder slept peacefully through the afternoon, without even pulling the blanket tighter around himself. Elias Rusk arrived at the shack 3 days after the storm ended. He did not come carrying food, and he did not come to apologize. The old carpenter came to inspect the shelter for himself. Bram Calder let him inside without a word. Rusk crouched beside the open trapdoor for nearly a minute before climbing down into the earth, with the careful movements of a man entering something he still did not fully trust. He carried a measuring stick under one arm and an old match tin in his coat pocket. The shelter was quiet except for the low hiss of the lamp flame. Elias measured the depth first, then the wall thickness. He tapped the shale lining with his knuckles and listened to the sound travel through the packed earth behind it. Finally, he struck a match and held it near the intake vent to watch the flame bend gently with the airflow. Bram explained only what mattered. "The wind can't reach this far down," he said. "Shale holds heat slow. Cabin only needs to keep water out. Doesn't need to fight the whole winter." Elias stayed silent after that. He lowered himself onto the narrow stone bench beside the wall and rested both hands against his knees while the match burned down between his fingers. For a long time, the old carpenter simply listened to this stillness underground. Then he looked once around the shelter and spoke without bitterness, without pride either. "I spent 30 years trying to keep winter out above ground." The sentence hung quietly in the warm underground air, and for the first time, Elias Rusk understood the difference between resisting nature and stepping beyond its reach. Change came quietly to Crow Ash Draw after the whiteout. There was no town meeting, no speeches, no sudden confession that Bram Calder had been right all along. The settlement simply began to sound different. Shovels struck frozen ground behind cabins at first light. Wagon beds carried shale stone from the hillsides instead of extra firewood. Old stovepipe sections disappeared from Nolan Price's store shelves almost as quickly as he unpacked them. People started digging. Some families carved narrow sleeping pits beneath their floorboards. Others built half-buried rooms against the hillsides where wind could not strike directly. A few men packed earth against the outer walls of sheds and cabins to stop heat from bleeding away underneath them. Even Elias Rusk changed his designs. His next winter structure sat lower to the ground with tighter roof clearance and almost no exposed crawl space beneath it. He stopped talking about taller chimneys and started speaking more carefully about trapped air, packed soil, and wind direction. Abigail Cross dug a small shelter into the base of the hillside behind her cabin before the next snowfall arrived. Nothing large. Just enough space for bedding, water, and a stovepipe hidden behind stacked timber. No one copied Bram Calder exactly. That was not how frontier towns worked. They adapted, adjusted, borrowed only what survival proved useful. And survival had spoken clearly during the Three Forks whiteout. Crow Ash Draw did not become stronger than winter after that storm. The settlement simply stopped fighting it the wrong way. For the first time in its history, people prepared for cold, using the earth itself instead of trusting fire alone. A week after the whiteout ended, Reverend Asa Whitcomb spoke about the storm during Sunday service inside the small church at the center of Crow Ash Draw. He never called what happened beneath Bram Calder's shack a miracle. The old minister knew better than that. "Miracles arrive without explanation," he told the room quietly. This was remembered wisdom. Most of the settlement understood exactly who he meant. By then, people had already started repeating one sentence often enough that it no longer sounded strange. "Under the frost line, the wind has no teeth." The phrase traveled through Crow Ash Draw, the same way frontier knowledge always traveled, passed from stove to stove, wagon to wagon, quietly, practically, without anyone claiming ownership of it for very long. Martha Calder remembered the storm years later more clearly than the winter itself. She remembered the sound of the wind screaming above the shack while the earth below remained still. She remembered the strange calm underground after weeks of fear. More than anything, she remembered that being the first winter, she stopped fearing the sound of Wyoming wind at night. Silas grew stronger after that season. The deep coughing that once followed every cold spell slowly disappeared as he got older. And Bram Calder returned to his ordinary work. He repaired wagon beds, shaped barrel staves, replaced cracked tool handles for ranchers and freighters passing through the draw. He never spoke about the shelter, as if he had invented something new. As far as Bram was concerned, the earth had always known how to survive winter. Men had simply forgotten to listen to it. Long before rail lines crossed Wyoming territory, before framed houses and cast iron stoves became symbols of progress, people survived winters another way. They lived inside pit houses, cut into frozen hillsides, slept in dugouts packed beneath prairie earth, built earth lodges strong enough to turn wind aside instead of confronting it directly. Across harsh country, for thousands of years, human beings learned the same lesson again and again. The ground was not the enemy. Exposure was. What Bram Calder built beneath the line shack at Crow Ash Draw was not an invention. No patent came from it. No newspaper carried his name beyond the valley. He simply remembered something frontier settlements had slowly started forgetting as cabins grew taller and fires burned hotter. A man did not always survive winter by overpowering it. Sometimes he survived by stepping outside its reach. While other families raised chimneys higher into the storm and fed their stoves until the iron glowed red, Bram moved in the opposite direction. He lowered his shelter beneath the frost line, where the wind could no longer strip warmth away faster than life could replace it. That was the truth the whiteout finally revealed. Not all shelter stands above ground. Some of the strongest shelters disappear into it. People remembered the Three Forks whiteout for many years after that winter. They remembered frozen livestock, buried cabins, and smoke blowing sideways across Crow Ash Draw for 8 straight days. But the people who survived it remembered something else more clearly. They remembered a quiet wagon repairman forced out of town with 2 children, and almost nothing left to his name, who looked down at the frozen earth instead of up at the storm. And because of that choice, he understood winter better than anyone around him. The storm did not spare Bram Calder. It simply could not reach where he chose to live. Would you have trusted Bram Calder's underground shelter before the blizzard hit, or would you have called him desperate like the rest of Crow Ash Draw?